Hi, everybody. Good evening, all of you. As Alexander Pope rightly mentioned, oh monsters, these critics, and Sheridan would say in his famous play, and he would refer to critics as abominable, infernal, villainous, licentious. So I hope we are all geared for the session today. With me, Uttaran will be talking, and both of us will be talking about poetry reviewing and its pleasures and dangers. So it's interesting, for me at least, how one enters into poetry book reviewing or book reviewing in general. I don't know if it's a conscious choice or if it's just a set of coincidences that lead one to become so. Because a poetry book reviewer is always working with somebody else's work, writing 800 to 1,000 words column, always saying good things, even resorting to cliches such as blockbuster, landmark novel, or even saying this book will be read and remembered long after the last page has been turned over. And the interesting thing is that even a slight change of opinion or a difference of opinion is going to turn him into a sinner of all kinds. Sins like jealousy, pettiness, poor reading, or even ad hominem attacks. So Uttaran, first things first, how did you land up into poetry reviewing, and how does reviewing other forms, films, fiction and non-fiction, inform your poetry reviews?
Right. Thank you so much, Kinshuk, for that really interesting introduction to our session. But before I answer your question, I'd like to take a moment and thank the organizers for even thinking that a session on poetry reviewing was necessary.
Absolutely.
Right? Yes, please, a round of applause for the organizers who thought about it. Because the conventional wisdom in publishing in India, at least, is that poetry does not sell. So big publishers do not really want to publish poetry. And you cannot blame them, right? How many people are going to go to a bookshop and buy a book of poems as opposed to some other book, right? And if poetry is the stepchild of Indian publishing, then poetry reviewing is the abandoned child of Indian journalism, right? There's no space at all for, and Kinshuk can come in on that. There's really, if you pitch a review of a poet to an editor, the editor will often turn up their noses and say, who's going to read these 800 words, right? Who's going to read this 1,000-word piece that you're writing? And therefore, it has to be a very conscious choice to be reviewing poetry, right? I'll just tell you very briefly about my journey. I was a student of English literature. So for 5 years, I studied how to analyze texts. And then I worked as a journalist, mainly as a sub-editor, so more analysis and writing of texts. And eventually, when I started reviewing poetry, when I started reviewing books, it was not poetry, right? It was non-fiction generally, which I feel is the easiest to review. And then fiction. And then finally, somehow I convinced my editor at Business Standard that we must have a column because Indian poetry is like, really, Indian poetry in English especially, of course, is really like becoming big and, we should have. And somehow, they were convinced. They gave me, though they were business paper, they gave me a column every fortnight to write about poetry. But then that column shut down, right? The pandemic happened, there was cost cutting, a Business Standard decided to reduce 2 pages from their edition on Saturdays, and the column went away. But I'm really thankful to my editors at The Wire, who gave me space. Of course, they're a website, so they don't have to worry about newsprint and the rising price of newsprint in India. And that's how it happened. And I think my column in Wire has been somewhat of a success among people who read Indian poetry, people who write Indian poetry, and as my wife, who's not a poet, often says, it's the Indian poets who are reading the other Indian poets. Like there's hardly an audience beyond that. But Kinshuk, why don't you tell us about your journey?
Oh, I think it has been similar. I landed up into book reviews just by chance because I would like to analyze a text critically. And I think it's very important for you to be able to analyze a text critically and to be able to see what it does and what it does new and what it does better. As I was becoming I was becoming a writer, a poet. So I think that was that. And yeah, I mean, similar experiences, but I have not been so fortunate that, you know, I'm getting so many books every day that his wife keeps complaining that he's getting every day some or the other books to review. So absolutely. Coming back to what we've been talking about, what do you think a good review should accomplish? I'm sure you're reading a lot of superficially written reviews, hastily written reviews, which actually superficially skim through the surface and don't go deeper into the text. And while with fiction and non-fiction, summary is the norm. You know, reviewers write summary. It's not possible with poetry, of course, but then I see there is an inordinate focus on talking about the themes, rather than talking about how a poet is able to bring out those themes stylistically. You know, all these experiments in form, line breaks, and how a particular line looks on a page. So one is that thing. Another thing that I often feel is missing is this ability to be able to look a book in a larger picture. So I think those two things I've been noticing much. What do you think are missing, and what do you think is a good review?
Right. Thank you for that question. You know, I'm sure you know this. Reviewing different genres, there are particular challenges to those genres, right? You know, non-fiction, you need to understand what the thesis is. Then you need to look at how much research this person has done, what methodology they have used. Fiction, of course, does it have the kind of emotional or intellectual, is it able to get that kind of response? Poetry, I feel, is the most difficult one to review, right? Most poetry books are very slim, right? They're not more than 100 pages, but you know, they're so dense, right? And as you rightly pointed out, reviewing a book of poems is not just talking about what the poet is saying, right? It's also about understanding the way the poet is saying it, right? I like to give, you know, when I teach it to my students, I like to give the analogy of a sports writer or a food writer, right? Or a person who writes on music. They would never think, you know, nobody would dare to write about music without having a good grasp of how this music is done, right? Even if they are not musicians themselves, to understand how the different, you know, ragas work, maybe, right? Or how an instrument works, maybe, or the history of that instrument.
Yeah.
The problem I feel with much of the reviewing that goes around, you know, I feel that there is no engagement with that part of it, somehow, right? And mostly it is about, you know, what the poet is saying, which is fine, and also because very often there's not enough space or enough time to engage more deeply. So yes, that's what very often happens, right? But there is the flip side to it. Right? I feel a poet must understand that a review, or a writer, any writer must understand that a review is somewhat different from the endorsement for the book, right?
Absolutely.
Endorsement is pre-publication. You go out to people you admire, or you feel, you know, if you get an endorsement from this person, your book will sell better. At least I do that, right? I try to get an endorsement from some. It's like an advertisement, right? But a review is not that. And a review, to be really balanced, will not only point out what's great with your book, and there is something definitely great because a publisher has decided to put in money to publish your book, right? And invested time in it. But there'll also be flaws. And you know, a reviewer will often highlight those flaws somewhere in the review. And you need to be comfortable with that, right? Just to, you know, make one final point, I just feel that a review really does not affect the fate of a book in any major way, right? And I can tell you about my personal experience. When my novel came out in 2020, it did not get reviewed very widely, and people who reviewed it did not really like it that much, but it got, you know, it got optioned for a film, and I did earn quite a bit of money from it. So you know, bad reviews do not really affect the, you know, the fate of a book really that badly, right? So I think, you know, this acceptance of a critical viewpoint is also very necessary. But what has been your experience?
Oh, similar. I think with my book, which is a Hindi book, And in Hindi, you don't have a lot of spaces for book reviews. We keep talking about English book reviewing market, which is obviously infinitesimally dismal. But I think with Hindi, it's even worse. You don't have many newspapers, and often these newspaper editors are very shady in publishing book reviews. So, so I think books work organically, and one should allow them the time it requires for them to do their own things. And I think the best kind of reviews is, a person talking about your book. So that, I think, is the best kind of review that you ever get. But then, coming back to what you've said now, that a review doesn't make or break a book. Earlier, there was a time when criticism was an important field of discipline. I mean, a reviewer, a critic would talk about a particular book and make or break it. But right now, I'm wondering about the status of a serious reviewer. And by serious, I mean a reviewer who is working for these magazines and newspapers where there is some sort of an editorial check. Because there is this generation of readers who've become reviewers and who are posting aesthetic pictures of books, and they're talking overtly positive about such books. In Hindi, we say bhuto na bhavishyati, which means something hasn't been written before and something wouldn't be written afterwards. So where do you find the place of a serious reviewer in the kind of scenario that we live in?
Right. So I must say that I have no objection to people posting beautiful pictures of books. Right. As a writer, I feel like somebody takes a beautiful picture of my book and posts it, I'll be very happy about it. Of course, if somebody comes and tells me your book is so nice, I'll be very happy about it. Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And when people say your book is not so nice, right, I'll not be so happy about it. So I mean, I guess that's fine. But yes, I mean, your question where you say where is the space for somebody who's a serious reviewer, right? I would say, literature is not just about the writer and the reader, buying a book and reading a book and talking about a book, but it's also about other people, right? So who is a reviewer? If you want to ask that question, I would say a reviewer is one who reads books obsessively, right? Who, researches the market or the publishing world obsessively, right? So I write at least 4 or 5 reviews a month, maybe 6. So which means I'm reading like 6 books a month, 200
which
pages
is
each.
huge.
Which is a huge amount of reading.
Absolutely.
Right? So naturally, naturally that gives me some perspective into what's happening in the world of literature, right? And a person who's not doing that will not have that perspective.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
I'm not saying that person's opinion is not correct. All of us have an opinion about how the Indian cricket team should play. But all of us are not going to get a job as a commentator in the coming World Cup. And there's a reason for that. Those who are getting jobs as commentators, or those who are going to go and report on it, the sports journalists, they have a certain expertise, right? It's not to say that my opinion on cricket doesn't matter. Of course it matters. But again, there is an expertise, and I think we should respect that. We wouldn't think about, other professions and treating it with the same disrespect. For instance, you're a doctor, right? I know that if I have a headache, I need to have a medicine, right? But I would not disrespect your medical opinion because you have a certain expertise. You have spent 5 years studying that.
Absolutely.
And there's something in that, right? So see, similarly with the world of literature, it's not just because it's writing and reading, which all of us can do if you're literate, doesn't mean you can disrespect a person who's investing time and energy and effort in learning more and more about it, right?
Thank you so much. Now talking about the review culture, obviously the critics are long gone and now we have only reviewers. And there was this wonderful culture, earlier it used to exist in Indian poetry in English, that an elder poet or a senior poet would introduce a younger emerging poet to the audience. And I've read stories where people would wait for Khushwant Singh's column in the Hindustan Times, or would wait for Jayantada's letters personally written to them after their book would come out. Now what is happening is that contemporary poets are reviewing each other. And I don't have a problem with that, but what happens is that when they are doing it, so they will always have a fear, because their book is going to come out the next year. And so, one has to scratch their back, a poet's back, to get this similar kind of treatment. Also, I think when poets are doing it, so obviously it's subjective based on relationship with a particular poet, but what happens is that, you are doing some sort of a conversation with the poet and not really talking to a vast majority of readers who might otherwise be interested. So it creates an echo chamber where, obviously, poets are reading poets and poets are talking about poets. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think you're right. But obviously, I'm sure everybody understands what the problem with that is. Right? So, I think we should be frank and come with disclosures. Right? Okay. So if I review books by my friends, I should put in a disclosure and say that, this is a book by a friend of mine. Right? And I have many friends who are poets because of my, where I am. Right? And if you don't put that disclosure, I think you're being very dishonest to your reader. Absolutely. Right? So, I teach journalists and I teach public relations students who are studying for public relations, right? And both of them are wonderful professions. But when public relations, when a public relations professional pretends to be a journalist and then comes to you with their opinion, that I think is a dishonest way of going about doing it. Yeah. Right? If you want me to buy your product and you come to me and say my product is the best product and you should buy it, I will take a look at it. But if you come to me and say I'm a neutral reviewer of this product and don't reveal to me that you're getting paid by the company to sell that product, right? Then that's dishonesty with me, right? And I feel a reviewer also shouldn't do that. So if I'm hoping that, okay, if I give a good review to this writer will give me a good endorsement when my book comes out, and will review my book and say nice things about my book. Really, I don't think that's the way to go about doing stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah?
And I think integrity as a reviewer is the most important thing that you would want.
Yeah. Integrity as a poet also.
Yeah.
Right? If you're a poet and you're reading other people's poetry, you should be able to say without any fear, I don't like this poem. Right? And if you cannot say that, then you're not being honest, are you?
Obviously. Thank you for that. Now coming to the culture of newspapers and magazines. Philippa K. Chong, who is a famous US reviewer, she mentions in her book, Inside the Critics Circle, that only 5% of the books that come out in the US get reviewed in major literary outlets. And that brings me obviously to multiple problems that one faces. First is that it's very difficult to get in a poetry book review pitch. Even if you get it, editors would be mostly biased towards bigger names, who anyways don't know a review or an endorsement that way. And then, there's this 800 or 1,000 word limit, which is going to be very restrictive, because how would you talk about such an expansive book of poetry in so many words? So what do you think are other problems, or how do you, relate to those problems? And, I've been seeing a lot of small literary magazines have come out in English. For example, Usawa Literary Review, the Bangalore Review, the Bombay Literary Magazine, Gulmohar Quarterly, and quite others. So how are they trying to fill up the gap that, big newspapers aren't able to really fulfill?
Right, and as a reviewer yourself, I'm sure you have a wide view of what's happening in the world of poetry reviewing. You're absolutely right. Newspaper editors do not want to review books of poetry, especially of a young poet or a new poet whom no one knows about, right? And they'd rather review a book of poems by somebody who's already a celebrity in some other field, and they have written a book of poems. Maybe the book of poems is also marvelous, right? But they are not getting reviewed because of their poetry, they're getting reviewed because of their celebrity in some other field, right? Then come writers who are already famous, and then they get reviews. And then of course come people who are not well known. What I have tried to do with my column in The Wire is try and review people who have published their first book from an independent press, right? Who will find it a little difficult to get into a mainstream publication, right? And that's the major challenge I feel, right? I don't know if the independent publications or independent magazines, where I also publish, and they do wonderful work. I can see Mani here, who is also an editor at the Bombay Literary Magazine, and I'm sure there are many others here. They provide that space which mainstream journalism does not provide, right? But my only concern is, do they reach to an audience who would not really read a book of poems? Would they read a review in that magazine and then pick it up, right? Further, of course, now all of us have become smarter about how the algorithms in social media work. Absolutely. And they do not favor independent or low-cost publications. So that's a problem. But it's still happening, right? People are still reviewing poetry, absolutely, right? And people are still writing about poetry. So that's I think there's some hope in that.
Okay. Yeah. There's always been a distinction about good poetry, bad poetry, Instagrammable poetry, serious poetry, page poetry, or slam poetry. And why I bring it up here is also because we see a lot of these big publishers publishing books by Instagram poets, not because of the merit of poetry, but because they have so many followers, and they will be able to sell the books. Vis-a-vis, there are so many independent presses, which are working in India, and there's some sort of an indie press revolution that we are, looking at. So what are your thoughts about it, and what do you think of, big presses and small presses, and how that system can be strengthened?
Right. Well, I mean, we had a session just a few minutes before where there was, Shohini and Prerna, who have both worked at HarperCollins, and they did talk about it at greater length. I have been published by an independent press, and I've been published by Pan Macmillan, which is a mainstream publication company. I can understand why the mainstream press goes for people who are already famous, right? Now, personally, I don't know what a good poem is, right?
Absolutely.
Of course, as a student of literature, as a student of poetry, I have some sense of what might be a good poem, and I might be able to tell somebody that, okay, this is working or this is not working. But there's also a huge subjective element to it, right? And increasingly, all over the world, major literary theorists, critics are talking about that subjective element. Something that works for me subjectively may not work for someone else. It's also a place of history and geography, right? So for instance, I live in India, so I write about Indian stuff. When I submit that to a very famous magazine in the West, they just might not relate to it.
Absolutely.
Right? And they might be like, this is not working as poetry, right? I feel it's very heartening. I mean, when I started thinking of having a manuscript of poems and I wanted to get it published, there was really nobody. Like, it was a barren space 15 years ago. There were really no independent publishers, except maybe one or two, right? There was Poetry Wala, yes, Writers Workshop, right? But that's it. Now there are so many more. Right? There's Coppercoin, there are others. I Write in Print, which published my Red River, they call themselves now, which published my book.
Havakal,
Dholi Books, right? So many different independent publishers, and it's great that they have created this space. Right? I think the most exciting poetry is actually being published by this independent presses, but that I think is a phenomena all over the world. Right? It is independent presses that actually find out the actual cutting edge work and publish it. Take for instance City Lights, right? In San Francisco, which actually discovered not only the beat poets, but also the New York School of Poetry, and published them, right? And mainstream publishers, of course, wouldn't be able to publish it for various reasons, right? I don't blame the mainstream publishers; they have their constraints, right? And that's how it happens, right?
Also, I think Indian English poets have an inordinate focus on, getting published into the poetry magazine or in the Paris Review. And they've not been able to actually tap into the readers, the indigenous readers who might be interested in their work. However, we know of a lot of poets who were working in local languages, and they were able to tap that market, and some of them were also able to make a living out of it. How do you see that? And I mean, would you have any data to talk about it?
Yeah, I think it's really sad that Indian writer or Indian poets in English do not have a direct connection with an audience, right? I shared some data with you. In the last census, for the first time, 83 million people said that their second language was English, right? So Hindi is the most spoken second language, and then English. 83 million is a huge, huge market.
Absolutely.
And what is the average number of books that an Indian poet will sell? 200, 300, 500 if they're lucky, right? 1,000 if they are, if they're already well known, right? This, I think, is very, very sad, right? I feel Indian poets who write in English are like those people who are trying to balance themselves on two boats, right? Because, of course, for most of us, our first language is not English. Our first language is whatever our mother tongue is, right? For most of us. Those of us for whom our mother tongue is English are also familiar with other languages and other literatures. So we're trying to be on that boat, right? Trying to understand that literature. At the same time, we are looking towards, Western poets, European poets, people who have written in English as their first language, right? And we are constantly trying to do this balancing act, and maybe we are falling somewhere in the middle.
Absolutely.
And not being able to get or tap into this huge audience that's really waiting. And I think to a certain extent, fiction has been able to do that in India, right? Reach out to this very large audience and, maybe get readers for their work, right? But I don't have a magic formula. I think as poets, we have to really think about why we can't reach out to so many people who actually speak in English. Right?
Absolutely. So we have some time. I think if there are any questions from the audience, we would be happy to take them.
Uttaran and Kinshuk, thank you so much for a wonderful session that sort of really covers the back end of the poetry writing part of it. I'd like to know, if we can have a school of translation. What about a school of reviewing? What are your thoughts on it? And do you really think, because the reason why I say this is because, unlike poetry, which many people say can't be taught, reviewing surely can be taught. And not only in the domain of Indian English writing. Kinshuk is a writer of the Hindi language, and he's a Hindi poet, as well as short stories. So what do you, both of you, think, whether it's Hindi or English, about an institution like that? I mean, I know Ashoka has an institution on school of translation. What about a school of critiquing?
I think that's an interesting question, and one can obviously think about it. Obviously, it's a difficult run because we have not been able to even establish MFAs in India. So I don't know how we can do it, but if we can do something like that, I think it's interesting. It's going to bring out a lot of diversity, and perhaps then there can be magazines attributed to reviews and critiques, and we could have that kind of magazine, because in Hindi we have this rich tradition of magazines. There are a lot of magazines, monthly magazines that would come out, and there are a couple of reviews, but we don't have any magazine in English which publishes poetry or poetry book reviews. So I think that can be an interesting way to think about it.
I think to a certain extent it's taught in the literature departments, right? I studied in the literature department for 5 years. So you're taught how to analyze text, how to analyze poetry, etc., right? But the academic writing, academic literature writing has become so obscure thanks to, the French theory from the 1960s and 70s, that it is completely inaccessible. Like, as a student of literature, I don't understand half the times what is written in those academic papers. So I think there should be an effort to bridge that gap, which is already happening in many places, right? People who write academically are also writing in popular spaces and trying to, be more accessible to people, right? Yes, I mean, there is no culture of magazines, but some magazines do publish, like Caravan or Outlook. They do publish poetry and poetry reviews, right? But sure, I think, Maitreyee, the point that you made, reviewing can definitely be taught, right? The question is, are people really interested to learn how to really review, right? And of course, it's a lot of time and energy and effort that has to go into it. It's not an easy thing to do, right? I think Mani has a question.
Actually, first of all, I think that was Maithreyi, wasn't it? Fantastic idea. And also, it doesn't have to be an institute. It could. I'm a little bit busy now, Maithreyi, but it's a great idea for a course even. Even since you're in positions that you can probably propose a course, it helps students learn composition, right? It's a really great idea. The other suggestion I have is, you have written so many reviews, Uttaran, and Kinshuk also. Like, do you have blogs where you're putting links of all the reviews you've written? That, I mean, are the copyrights of these with the journals that you're writing them for? At least can you, how do you archive all this? Because this is really important material.
Oh, I'm bad with archiving and chronicling my things. So obviously, I've lost a lot of my reviews. I used to do it. Now, the good thing is that most of the reviews that would be published in print would be online, would be available online. So one can obviously go back and check. But then I've always been thinking of getting myself a website and then putting all the reviews so that I might want to, go back to them later.
Yeah, like Kinshuk, I'm also like really lazy with this archiving. And that's the journalist part of me. A journalist lives from one byline to the other, right? So one review has come out, I'm like already working on the next one, whatever. But thank you, Mani, for making that suggestion. I will really make an effort to get all these reviews together that I've written and create an archive. I do archive it on social media. Like the only things that I post on social media are reviews or are articles that I have written. I never post anything else, right? So most of it is probably there. Right? But yes, I mean, with the independent publications, the problem is that they might disappear, right? Because Shohini and I used to work for a magazine long back called the Four Quarters magazine. It was one of the initial literary magazines that was coming out at that point of time, last decade, right? Beginning of last decade. That has disappeared. So the few print copies that we saved, that is still there, but all that we wrote there is gone. So yes, I think we should try and create an archive of this.
Also, sometimes it happens that a online thing would be put under the paywall. Yeah. So you couldn't access it. I mean, it happened with an Indian Express article that I wrote because I didn't have a offline copy. And I mean, later when I wanted to go back to it, it was gone. So yeah. Any other question, comments?
Please feel free to comment. I think that's about it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to our session.